All right, it's officially 101, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to start by saying thank you to everyone who's shown up today. I definitely appreciate you guys being here. I will do my best to monitor the chat, but we also have Jess Duncan here as well, the education assistant, so she might be able to help you out if you have questions in the chat. Otherwise, yeah, we can hop on in. Thank you so much for being here. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Feel free to hop in the chat if you can't and then let me know if there's any issues. So I'll start with a little introduction and a little bit of housekeeping about what's going to be going on for the next hour. My name is Bailey Rep. I'm the Education and Communications Coordinator here at EKISC. We also have Jess, as I mentioned, on the call as well. Super stoked to have her here. She will be presenting next week on Tuesday at 1 p.m. on an invasives crash course. So definitely feel free to attend that. It should be pretty awesome. Tell your friends and family. It should be great. Today we're covering weeds and wildflowers, so something a little bit different, and just comparing the two, seeing how we can tell the difference and what's local in our area. Before I hop into introductions, I will give a little clarification that I am not a native plant expert. If you are, if there's someone here that is, please feel free to hop in the chat and help us along too. We always appreciate the input and collaboration. So yeah, I'll start off with a little intro and then move on into our presentation today. So for those of you that don't know, we're the East Kootenay Invasive Species Council. We're a nonprofit that was formed in 2008, and we help coordinate invasive plant management and mitigation strategies across the East Kootenay region. We work with a cross-section of stakeholders who are united in their efforts to manage invasive species. Our education programs are generously funded by CBT and HCTF. We are super thankful for them, and they're the reason why this is able to happen today. Today we will be covering wildflowers and weeds. We're going to start with a little bit of review. So this might be a little bit drier for some of you for the first couple minutes. We're going to go over what makes invasive species invasive, and a little blurb about, invasive species as a whole in the area. And we're going to talk about characteristics, and then we're going to go into some ID. So I've picked about 11 plants for you today that are invasive or native to talk about and compare them. And then we're going to talk about what you can do and how to report any invasives that you see. And just one last piece, you don't have to remember everything today. We will be covering quite a lot of information, and you're always welcome to use EKISC as a resource. So if you have any questions, you can go to our website. You can always email me personally, whatever is easiest for you. So let's go on and get started. So we're going to start with our little bit of review, what makes an invasive species invasive before moving on to our wildflower ID today. So there's a lot of terminology in the invasive species world. A lot of different words are used and thrown around here. So we're just going to go over a few. Let's start with native species, of course, something that's evolved in a specific region over thousands of years, something that's been here for as long as we can remember, or at least long enough that it's within our realm. Non-native is a species living outside of its native distributional range, which has arrived there by human activity, deliberate or accidental. These also might be known as alien, introduced, exotic, or ornamental plants. Invasive species are specifically non-native species that cause economic, social, or environmental harm. Almost all invasive species are introduced from somewhere else, but not all introduced species are technically invasive. And noxious weed is another term that we use quite a bit. This is a term specifically used by the BC Weed Control Act and regulations. So this is an invasive species that has been designated by provincial authorities as one that is injurious to agricultural, horticultural crops, natural habitats, ecosystems, humans, or livestock. So not all invasives are noxious weeds or make those lists. And some actually get taken off those lists. For example, a species like dandelions are not a noxious weed anymore. They have forage value for animals. Some daisies, although they are noxious, are too abundant for us to attend to as an invasive species. So lots of different things going on, lots of moving parts, and those lists are usually updated yearly by us and by the province. On that note, talking about invasive impacts. So there's three big things that make an invasive an invasive. So it can be one of these things or all three. The first is economical. So The official number is actually unknown. We don't have reporting on things like industry, forest, or mining activity, just because there's limited data. We do know that plants specifically had $139 million estimated for 2020 in reclamation costs, and an estimated 50 million in annual crop loss as well. So a few different things going on there. And then we have environmental impacts. So these could be habitat loss or degradation, which we'll talk about a little bit before we get into our ID today. Water quality and quantity, they threaten biodiversity, introduce disease, and can alter fire regimes, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. And the third thing is cultural values. They reduce land and recreation opportunities, something that really can affect our lifestyle here in the East Kootenay. I know that hiking and horse riding and all these great things are important to me, and I'm sure they're important to you too. So yeah, we got to watch out for invasives for that. They can cause income loss, reduce property values, increase control and management costs, and there's export and import restrictions. So it makes it a bit trickier to export and import certain plants. So while we're only going to talk about plants today, I'm just going to play a quick little intro video on invasive species as a whole, just so we can get an example of how far spread everything is, and that it's not just plants that are here.
Invaders, not the space alien variety, but the uninvited plants, animals, and other organisms that arrive and cause harm in British Columbia. These plants and animals are called invasive species. Invasive species can be pretty, cute, and even cuddly, but when they enter and stay, they impact our environment, economy, and people in British Columbia. Invasive species threaten our native plants and animals by competing for food, water, and space, damaging habitat, and sometimes eating our native species, even babies. Invasive species affect the economy, for example, impacting fisheries and forest production, and reducing grazing land and crop yields. Invasive species also affect us by damaging the places where we live, work, and play. Some invasive species bite, prickle, and even cause allergic reactions. Invasive species are introduced by us, humans. The good news? Everyone can help reduce invasive species by doing things like cleaning, draining, and drying our boats, growing non-invasive plants in our gardens, not releasing unwanted pets or animals into the wild, and helping remove invasive plants. And everyone can spot and report invasive species in British Columbia. Let's stop the invasion.
All right, so just a little intro to invasive species on the whole there. We're really good introducers and spreaders, so I just wanted to show that video to show the full expansion of everything that's out there, since we mostly only talk about plants at EKISC. So why should we care? As conservationists, environmentalists, recreationalists, gardeners, industry folks, the problem is that invasive species are a systemic problem that affect us globally, continentally, nationally, provincially, regionally, and locally. Invasive species don't have any boundaries. They're often brought in from other continents, neighboring countries or regions or ecosystems within Canada as well. In Canada, alien species include at least 27% of all vascular plants, 181 insects that feed on woody plants, 24 birds, 26 mammals, 2 reptiles, 4 amphibians, several fungi and mollusks, and 55 freshwater fish. So this number fluctuates up and down for sure, but that's a lot of different animals here. The World Conservation Union's list of world's 100 worst invasive species include many that we find established here in Canada and in the RDEK. This includes Dutch elm disease, leafy spurge, Japanese knotweed, purple loosestrife, which we'll talk about today, green crab, spiny water flea, gypsy moth, and lots of others as well. Although this is a global problem, we at EKISC focus right here on the regional issues in the RDEK. So a little more on invasive impacts. Yeah, the problem can be severe and often irreversible. However, it is preventable. So that's the greatest thing about doing this work, is that it's something we can do right now to make sure that it doesn't impact us in the future. According to the World Conservation Union, invasive species are considered one of the most significant threats to biodiversity. This is usually right behind habitat loss. In their new ecosystems, invasive species become predators, competitors, hybridizers, and diseases of our native and domesticated plants and animals. So sometimes when we see them on a trail, we'll notice that over the years, if it goes unchecked, they'll start to choke out our native plants. So just a quick note as well on that habitat loss. So invasive species help out all the big three different types of habitat loss. So first, there's habitat destruction. For instance, a bulldozer pushing down trees is the iconic image of habitat destruction. But some invaders can physically alter habitat in addition to that destruction. 50 beavers from Canada were relocated to the Tierra del Fuego, an archipelago at the southern tip of South America in 1946 to be hunted. Since then, they have multiplied and now number in the hundreds of thousands. The trees in the region are not adapted to beaver activity as they are in North America, and lots don't grow back. So additionally, beaver activity can also create ponds that flood in portions of the forest, and these bodies of stagnant water alter the nutrient cycle in forests, and invasive plants will thrive here. So even we are guilty of it too as Canadians. We have pests other places and lots of different things coming here. The second one is habitat degradation. So pollution, invasive species, and disruption of ecosystem processes, such as changing the intensity of fires in an ecosystem. Invasive species, especially invasive grasses, help intensify or quicken this changing ecosystem type. And then the last is habitat fragmentation. So much of the remaining terrestrial wildlife habitat in Canada and the US has been cut up into fragments of road and development. Invasive species love disturbed areas. They'll move in quickly and fight for that forage against native species, making reclamation a lot harder. So I mentioned those things as things that we can all care about, and how invasive species interweave into almost every part of climate change and in our own lives. So let's talk a little bit about characteristics. When we're looking at any invasive species, there are a few ways that we can tell that something might be invasive right off the hop and help us identify those plants. So one of the first big ones is outcompete native species. They fight for that forage, they fight for space, fight for sunlight. They usually lack predators, and that's how they become invasive. If something doesn't have a pathogen or a predator or maybe a disease to keep its population in check, it will take off. They thrive in disturbed areas, just like I mentioned before. They love roadsides, they love big trails, they love cut blocks, they love all that good stuff. So they're really good at working in those areas. They form monocultures, like the blueweed on the right side of this photo here. If you've driven through Jaffrey recently, you might see fields of these. If you're in Kimberley, you will see these popping up everywhere. I've gotten a lot of complaints this year about blueweed in Kimberley. The prolific producers as well. You know, some plants will reduce thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of seeds. Some of them are rhizotomous, which we'll talk about in our next slide as well, how they spread. Seeds can be viable for many years, sometimes up till 60. I write this down, that's probably on the high end, but some can last in the soil for a really long time. Some of them have phenotypic plasticity, so they're adaptable to a wide range of conditions. So think about, for instance, the dandelion, even though it's not considered invasive anymore. It grows in sunny places, shady places, wet, dry, you name it. Lots of invasive plants have this capability too. Some are allelopathic. For instance, good old spotted knapweed, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with by now in this area. It literally sends chemicals into the soil to kill off its neighbors. And we're noticing that invasive species have way longer photosynthetic periods. So some of the plants I'll talk about today, I'll mention some growing stages, but this is changing a lot with our new climate as well. So just a quick note about how plants reproduce. So if we know how they reproduce, we can identify them a little bit better. We can also manage our mitigation efforts a lot better by making sure that We're protecting areas, say, downstream from a plant that's really good at sending seeds downriver. Or if we have disturbed areas or somewhere where we're burning, we might know not to burn that place if fragments can cause new plants to be regenerated. So yeah, this might help you think of the ways in which plants are distributed. So first up, we have vegetative reproduction. So this is a process by which new plants are produced from other plant parts other than seeds or spores. This is a natural process in many plant species, one used by horticulturalists to start new plants from existing plants quite often. I know that I do this when I break a piece of succulent off to grow a new one to share with my friends. Some example of this, these vegetative reproductive structures are rhizomes, so underground stems, and stolons, which are the stems running along the surface of the ground. So plants like this might produce really dense localized infestations. They might disperse greater distances if their structures break off and fall into water or are carried by animals or people. They can also present really complex management challenges. For instance, yellow toadflax plants produce rhizomes. So pulling toadflax is often ineffective because new plants can actually sprout from those fragments that are left in the soil. And of course, seeds are another way that plants reproduce. They're uniquely designed for various means of dispersal. You know, many have feathery structures that allow them to be carried long distances by the wind. Other are prickly, sticky, or even tasty, so that they'll be transported by attaching to animals' fur or feet, or maybe on the bottom of our own boots. So I just want to show you guys a quick video here of Himalayan balsam and how it can reproduce. It's pretty neat to watch. And since we're going to be talking about it as well a little bit later. So these are seed pods that explode and shoot their seeds quite far. So there are lots of different ways that these plants can disperse their seeds. Even though it's an invasive, I think that one's pretty cool. Nature's pretty neat, but nonetheless, we can see why infestations can get really dense and how they can spread in many different ways. So a quick note on how do they spread? Of course, yeah, rhizomes and vegetative reproduction, probably the wind a lot of the time, water and gravity. Humans, us, we're highly, highly mobile. We have a variety of objects that seeds or plant parts can stick to, such as trucks or boots or clothes. Non-specialist animals, for instance, burdock sticks to anything with fur or feathers. Or maybe even specialist animals, something like the Clark's nutcracker or flying squirrel. They're really effective distributors of seed, but only with a target species. So what you can do if you suspect invasive plants, and we'll go over this again at the end a little bit, but first things first, be suspicious of plants that seem to pop up out of nowhere and form monocultures. You can take a couple minutes to look at it and see if it matches up with anything in the Report Invasive app or using other resources such as books or ID apps. And our motto over here at EKISC is, if it grows like a weed, it probably is a weed. But with a side note of not always, for instance, Arrowleaf balsamroot, which we'll talk about today too. Okay, so let's get on into some identification. I appreciate you guys bearing with me now to this point after that review. And now we're going to talk about a few native and invasive plants as we go, things that are similar And we're going to talk about their identification characteristics and maybe some ways that you can tell them apart. First up, we have Himalayan balsam and the native Nootka rose. So the way I've set this presentation, we'll always have the invasive on the left side and our native plant on the right side. Himalayan balsam, what we just looked at with that crazy seed shooting video. The Himalayan balsam is also known as the policeman's helmet. It's originally from the Himalayan region of South Asia. This plant can take over areas with moist soils, including streams and riverbanks, which is a place that the Nootka rose can also grow. It produces a lot of plant nectar, so it's a good bee attractant, and other pollinating insects also will gear towards Himalayan balsam instead of other naturally occurring plants if it's in an area. Those seed pods, when ripe, can explode up to 7 meters from the plant. And yeah, definitely creates dense stands, reducing biodiversity and ecological values when it takes over an area. It can grow 0.6 to 2 meters tall and has purplish hollow stems with many branches. The flowers can range in color from white, pink, and purple. I've mostly seen pink ones, but I have seen one white one before. The flowers are in this hooded shape, which gives it the appearance of a traditional English police helmet. So that's where it gets its second common name from. And the leaves will be 6 to 15 centimeters long with sharply toothed edges. So if you look at the photo in the bottom right of the Himalayan balsam side, you can see it has little serrated edges all around. And then it also has this purplish red strip right up the middle. The photo is pretty small on the left-hand side here, but you can see its purplish stalks heading up the middle as well. So on the right-hand side, we have our lovely native Nootka rose. There's plenty of this growing about. My in-laws live out in Bull River, and I love driving to their house because there's these random little spots of wild rose on the side of the road. I think it's really pretty. It's a spindly shrub. It grows about 0.5 meter to 3 meters tall. It can grow individually or in thickets. You'll want to watch out for prickles at the base of each leaf and on the branches. It has alternating leaves that are a little more elliptical with a pointed end. They are as well toothed, so their serrations are a little bigger than the Himalayan balsam. And they grow about 1 to 7 centimeters long as well. When they're blooming, they're usually soft pink, about 4 to 8 centimeters across with yellow stamens, so this little part in the middle there. And they prefer open, moist habitats such as shorelines, thickets, forest edges, meadows, roadsides, and clearings in low to mid elevations, so a lot of similar places as Himalayan balsam. They're more frequently found here in the southern interior than in the north. And fun fact, their tender young shoots can be stripped or eaten raw. Next up, we have purple loosestrife versus fireweed. Fireweed is my most favorite plant, so I'm a little biased towards this one. And recently we've been working on a very large project out by Fort Steele and Bummers Flats on purple loosestrife. So we'll start with purple loosestrife over there on the left-hand side. It's present in nearly every Canadian province and almost every US state at this point. This point has the ability to produce as many as 2 million seeds in a growing season. So they create these really dense stands that outcompete native plants for habitat. So if you ever get a chance to go out to Bummers Flats, maybe for a canoe, you're definitely going to see this plant and see how localized these infestations get. These populations result in changes to ecosystem functions. So when it grows densely like that, it can reduce nesting sites, shelter, and food for birds, and overall creates a decline in biodiversity. The plant mass grows on average to be 60 to 120 centimeters tall and averages 1 to 15 flowering stems. Purple loosestrife has evolved to tolerate the shorter growing season and colder weather of the central and northern parts of the provinces. So that's one of the reasons it does super well here. It's definitely really good at adapting. And because of this, the chances are pretty good that it's going to be very resilient to climate change as well. So you'll often find these along shorelines. They can escape into new areas when seeds and viable plant material are discarded into a nearby waterway. So sometimes maybe it accidentally falls out of a truck where someone was pulling it into a ditch, or maybe it's been carried by a flooding rain event down the road. So it's easily distributed. Road maintenance and construction create disturbed sites as well, which can contribute to the spread, and equipment too, since it can transport by seed and by fragments. So being really careful if you are near purple loosestrife, to make sure that you're brushing your boots or making sure your tires are clean, and also cleaning down your watercraft. Say you're canoeing out at Bummers Flats, making sure to stop by the Wassa car wash on the way out to wash your boat. Purple loosestrife has a square woody stem. So if you see it and you're not sure exactly what it is, you can roll it between your fingers and you will feel its squared edges. It's a pretty neat way to identify purple loosestrife. So moving on to fireweed on the right side. Fireweed is a narrow-leafed, showy, clumped perennial, commonly growing 3 to 5 feet tall. It has a smooth stem. So its stem is usually reddish, just like purple loosestrife, but it is smooth around. And they have numerous elongate alternating leaves, and they end in this tapering spike of a rosy purple flowers. These flowers have 4 petals and are usually about 1 inch across, depending on the maturity of the plant. The seeds are windborne by tufts of hairs and are produced in slender pods that open from the top downward, which is pretty neat to see. Fireweed is a sun-loving plant that quickly invades burned out forests to form dense masses of color, and are super popular amongst long-tongued bees for pollination. So if you're lucky enough to do hiking up in some avalanche paths, or maybe in a previous burn area, you will probably see a lot of fireweed in this area. It is pretty darn beautiful, I think, to see a big field of pink. And yeah, they're just a lovely native plant that we have. Next on my list here, and these two are mostly different colors, but I do find that we do get some identification or misidentification rather when people are sending stuff in. We have a lot of white top plants as well, but just because of the umbel, so the top flower shape, we do get this one misidentified sometimes. So on the left side, we have common tansy. Very popular in the bouquet world. I know that I have one sitting right on my table right now that I'm going to have to carefully eliminate. The big thing about common tansy to look out for is that it is toxic to humans and livestock, so you want to be careful when dealing with it, making sure not to ingest it. It's often found in sunny, disturbed areas such as roadsides or pastures. I've definitely seen it on the sides to rails to trails around Kimberley and Cranbrook lately. It spreads via roots and seeds that can remain viable for up to 25 years. So it's a long hauler under the ground, which can make it a bit hard to manage. It's considered a noxious weed in lots of regions around BC as well. For ID, it has these bright yellow, flat-topped round flowers that grow in clusters. I think they kind of look like buttons. They're pretty cute, I think, but they are super invasive. Its foliage is a dark green color, and its leaves kind of look like ferns with sharp edges. So you can see on the photos on the left-hand side and on the bottom, these serrated fern-like leaves that they have. They usually range from about 0.4 to 1.5 meters tall as well, and they do grow in a big clump. They are usually fairly localized when they do grow together. On the right side, we have common yarrow. Common yarrow is a complex of both native and introduced plants, and they also have hybridized. So some of the yarrow you'll see, especially in this area, can be a hybrid of both one that was introduced as well as our native species. So can be a little bit complicated in that way. Yarrow grows to 3 feet tall and has no branches except near the top. The leaves are alternating 3 to 5 inches long, with many leaflets on each side of the midrib. They give them these delicate fern-like, almost lacy appearance. So if you don't see the flowers, sometimes these can be a bit difficult to tell apart. I also find that yarrow has a very similar leaf pattern to another invasive called scentless chamomile. They both have these really delicate fern leaves. The flower has 20 to 25 yellowish white ray flowers and similarly colored disc flowers as well. Next up is giant hogweed. So we definitely don't want plant like this in our area. If you ever think you see giant hogweed, feel free to report it. It's very similar looking to cow parsnip, but absolutely If you're unsure, feel free to report this plant. It's a perennial, part of the carrot family, and it contains a toxic sap that can cause hypersensitivity to sunlight. So this can result in really severe burns. So if you do think you see this plant, preferably don't get close, but if you do have to walk near it or through something you think might be it, it's worth having gloves on for sure and covering your skin. It grows along roadsides, ditches, and streams. It's really good at invading old fields and native habitats such as open woodlands as well. The seeds might take several years to germinate with giant hogweed and are viable in the soil for up to 15 years. During the first year, the plant produces a rosette of leaves up to 1 meter high, and it isn't until the 2nd to 5th year that it flowers. As it grows, a large root, thick hollow stems, and large lobe leaves are formed. The stems of the plant are covered with reddish purple flecks and stiff hairs with sap. Sap may also collect in the hollow stem bases, so just being careful as well if you break off this plant that you're looking out for the sap. Each plant can produce up to 120,000 winged seeds. Typically, that number is more around 50,000, but that's still quite a lot. And they can float for up to 3 days. So if giant hogweed is near a stream and those seeds get dropped in the water, it does have a couple of days of leeway that it can move downstream. So it can get pretty far. On the right-hand side, we have our native cow parsnip. So native cow parsnip is very, very similar looking. It's a robust, hairy perennial native to BC. It has large flat top compound inflorescences of white small flowers on top with large green winged leaves and has a single hollow stem. It can grow 1 to 3 meters tall and is often confused with giant hogweed. Let's see here. The stems are hollow and densely hairy, and the leaves are very large, up to 16 inches across and divided into lobes. Cow parsnip has the characteristic flower umbels of the carrot family as well, and they're about 8 inches across, flat top or rounded. So their white tops will be a little bit smaller than giant hogweed, and the plant as a whole will generally be a bit shorter. Giant hogweed, especially in a mature infestation, can grow really, really large, big and dense, and cow parsnip will stay lower to the ground. One way to tell the difference is that there are no purplish spots on the leaves, and they're less serrated leaves than giant hogweed. So take a look at the leaves there, especially when you're trying to identify. And if they're less serrated, they may be giant hogweed. They may be cow parsnip. There is a lot of cow parsnip up by the Flathead as well. We have done a drive-by up there, and it is not giant hogweed, which is very good. So if you do see it up there, it's most likely cow parsnip, which is good. But if you're unsure, always feel free to email us with a good photo and we can help you ID too. Next are 2 beautiful orange flowers. Well, I guess 1 beautiful orange flower if you're counting the native one. I don't think orange hawkweed's that nice. On the left, we have orange hawkweed. I like to call this the lanky dandelion. It's similar to yellow hawkweed, which we have a lot of in our area, which is also invasive. It grows on this one big stem. It's originally from Europe. They can create these dense mats that crowd out native plants, and they spread quickly through above ground runners, horizontal roots, and seeds. So it's good at growing in lots of different ways. Agricultural and recreational activities, wildlife, and wind can help the spread. You see a lot of these right now on the side of forestry roads or resource roads. We're seeing them pop up on the sides of trails, especially where mountain bikes are. One plant can produce hundreds of seeds, and it is considered noxious in many regions across BC. It grows 30 to 60 centimeters in height and has bright orange-red flowers clustered at the top. The plants have these bristly, hairy leaves and stems down at the bottom. There's usually few to no leaves found on the stem at all, and they do contain a milky fluid when broken open. And then on the right is the beautiful native tiger lily. Some of you also might be cultivating these in your garden. My neighbor in the backyard is, and it's very beautiful. They occur in lowland and montane forest openings and meadows. Usually native tiger lily will bloom June through early August. It can grow up to 1.2 meters tall and bears from few to numerous orange flowers with darker spots. So sometimes this plant won't necessarily flower. The tepals, so the inside bit that sticks out, are about 3 to 6 centimeters long, and the flowers are lightly scented. Like many true lilies, the leaves are arranged in whorls around the stem of the plant. So they kind of clasp all the way around and make their way up in a spiral. Fun fact about native tiger lily, they can be steamed, boiled, or pit cooked. It's bulbs. It's bitter or peppery tasting, and they were mostly used as a flavoring and often in soup with meat or fish. So the tiger lilies are edible when cooked. And here was our cover photo for all of our advertising for this webinar. Here's two that look quite similar before you know what they are. I feel like once you know Blueweed, you will be able to tell the difference quite a bit. And once you see it a lot in real life, you'll never forget it. You'll see it all over the place. So on the left, we have Blueweed, something that is really becoming a bit of an issue here in the East Kootenay that we're doing our best on. Especially down in the southern end of our management areas. It hasn't quite made as much of leeway up in the north and IPMAs or invasive plant management areas. So places like in Vermeer, you might find less of it. So be sure if you do see it, it's still absolutely worth reporting so that we know where the infestations are. Blueweed is native to Southern Europe and West Central Asia. It escaped from cultivation in North America as an ornamental, as many invasive plants do. It's now widely distributed throughout North America. It can also be called by the name of Viper's bugloss. Bugloss is Greek for ox tongue, which describes the shape and roughness of the leaves. Interesting fun fact. It does have some plant regulations on it. The Forest Range and Practices Act does list this plant, so I know forestry companies are keeping an eye out for it. It's listed as a noxious weed in many regions across BC, and as well as in the Weed Control Act, and there's restrictions on import of this plant. Its flowers are bright blue, 5-lobed, and found on the upper side of short stems. The stems are hairy. These hairs are a bit painful to the touch. It's almost like little tiny fiberglass prickles, mostly short hairs, but there might be some longer ones. So if you do see Blueweed and you're wanting to pull it, it is a really great plant to do weed pulls with in your community, making sure to wear gloves and maybe even long sleeve shirts. I do know that I get a rash almost every time. So just being careful with those stems, they can be a bit painful. At flowering, these plants can be 30 to 80 centimeters tall on average. I have seen some as tall as me, however, more recently, and I'm 5'6". So taking that with a grain of salt, I think with our really hot and long East Kootenay weather, they definitely are able to grow taller. And their leaves are also a little bit hairy and become smaller approaching the top of the plant. So unfortunately, I didn't put a rosette photo in here, but you can identify the rosettes pretty easily. They have those long ox tongue shaped leaves. They're nice and long basal leaves that thin out at the end and they grow in a really thick circle. Another way to ID Blueweed, if you're unsure, is to take a look at the stem. So it's not only prickly with those little hairs, but it does have these black or deep red spots on the stem. So it's usually the giveaway that it's not, say, lupin or something similar, are those little black spots all the way up and down. And they can be found on roadsides, drainage ditches, right-of-ways, fence lines and pastures, on rangeland, and any other disturbed area. They really thrive where the ground is disturbed. And on the right side, we have our beautiful lupin or lupine, however you like to pronounce it. And they're one of the more common wildflowers in BC, one of my favorites. This flower is a member of the pea family and is a perennial which can reach a height of over 70 centimeters. We also have smaller versions. I believe it's the silky lupin that grows way smaller, and we have that out at the Butte here in the Kimberley-Cranbrook area. It's very cute, but the big ones are gorgeous too. For the leaves, the majority come from the base of the plant on long stalks, so usually twice as long as the blade. Lupins have 6 to 8 leaflets that are 3 to 6 centimeters long, emanating from the end of the stem leaf. They're spear-shaped with sharp pointed tips and smooth upper surface with a hairy underside. So that's on the leaves there. They do have hairy undersides. At night, the leaflets fold down. The cluster of the leaflets follows the sun throughout the day, which is pretty cool, I think, in my personal opinion. So if you do have any by your house, maybe you get to see them be a bit of a sundial. The flowers are blue, purplish, or pink, 12 to 15 millimeters long, and they are usually in clusters along long spikes. So these are pea-like if you get up close, all in that pea family, similar to the snapdragon as well. Right here, I have written down fruit, 4 centimeters in hairy pods. So these are for the seed pods, they're a little hairy, and about 4 centimeters across. And they grow in moist climates throughout BC. They appear at all elevations, but are predominantly in mid to subalpine areas. They usually prefer open areas as well, but they do well as cultivated in your own personal garden too. Next up, we have St. John's wort versus mountain arnica. So for some in this area too, it can be surprising to learn that St. John's wort is actually an invasive species here in BC. An important note on it is that it is poisonous to livestock and contains a pigment that causes photosensitivity, especially for lighter colored animals. For instance, if you have blonde or white cows or goats, you just want to be careful around this plant, especially if it's in pasture, which it does enjoy taking over. The plant has a bright yellow flower, small triangular leaves that feature small black to purple dots. It's almost star-shaped. The petals are quite pointed on all of the ends. This is a low-level dense shrub and grows well in disturbed areas. It also has many medicinal properties and has European cultural roots and folklore beliefs that a house would be protected from thunder and evil spirits if hung from the windows. So if you need a little extra spiritual help too, maybe cultivating or pulling some St. John's wort would help us and maybe help out in your doorway. An ID tip is to squeeze the flower buds between your fingers and a purple stain will be produced. So it's also able to dye other things too, such as wool or fabrics. On the right-hand side, we have mountain arnica. So arnica, as a general species, are perennial herbs that grow 10 to 70 centimeters tall. The simple leaves are oppositely arranged with toothed or smooth margins and often feature granular trichomes, so they sometimes have little hairs on them. The composite flower heads are generally yellow and produced fruits, just a simple type of dry fruit with bristles for dispersal. Several species also have rhizomes, so they can produce both ways. Though fairly common in homeopathic and folk medicine, arnica is toxic and can cause fatal poisoning if taken internally. So we are definitely not doctors over here, but don't ingest either of these plants. It is used quite often topically, however. And mountain arnica specifically yields an essential oil used in treating bruises and sprains, and is often grown as an ornamental as well. I think arnica is a very pretty flower, and I've seen a lot of it this year. Next up is young burdock versus young arrowleaf balsamroot. So I decided to show these two flowers while they're still in rosette version. They're a bit easier to tell apart once they start to flower, but I did many webinars and workshops this year where I was like, oh, nothing looks like burdock in its rosette. And then I was walking up at the butte one day and remembered all the balsamroot and how similar it actually does look when it's young. So burdock here, its burrs were the inspiration for Velcro. Birds and bats can become trapped by the sticky burrs, and each individual plant can produce up to 16,000 seeds. It is considered a noxious weed in many regions of the province. Burdock itself can grow up to 2 meters tall and is an upright plant with reddish stems. So that's one way that you can definitely tell it apart from arrowleaf balsamroot. It will get a lot taller and it will also have these reddish stems. The mature leaves are large and heart-shaped and are characteristically hairy on the underside. And they might also be toothed or have wavy edges. So it can be both, can be a little serrated or be a little smoother. And the leaves can grow up to 50 centimeters long. So I find this plant to be a little reminiscent of rhubarb when it's first growing. It kind of comes out with those big leaves and it grows extremely fast. A young plant that I saw out in Norbury at the start of this season was about 5 inches long when I first went out. I went out a week later and it was about 12 inches long. So extremely fast growing. And down in the little right-hand side there, on the left-hand side of the screen, I have a photo of the burdock while it's in flower. So they can kind of look like thistles. So they have a pink to purple flower and they bloom July to October. And they definitely have those spiny hooked leaves surrounding the flower. When they do go to seed, the burrs are round and bristly and up to 22 millimeters wide. It usually doesn't flower until its second year, so you may not catch it in its first year before it does go to flower and to seed. At that time, if you do think you have burdock, it's definitely worth pulling it or mowing it down. Even small rosettes, though, can have a really big long taproot, so it can be difficult to eliminate the whole plant. So if you can, dig it up when it's super young, or at least just start mowing it down when it's still little. And then on the right-hand side, we have our beautiful sunflower, Arrowleaf balsamroot. It is maybe most found abundantly in mountain fields, but it can also be found as a common plant in the understory of conifer forests. This plant has beautiful bright yellow flowers, and in fact, another name for it is the Oregon sunflower down in the States. Like the rest of the sunflower family, its flowers are actually inflorescence composed of numerous tiny flowers, florets, that take up different jobs. Each of the petals, for instance, is actually a single floret bearing one enormous petal and a few minute ones. When taken together, these ray florets create an illusion of a ring of petals. The inflorescence is bigger than a silver dollar, but smaller than a CD, so about the size of a small floppy disk, for all of you out there that knows what those are. It can usually be seen in flower from May to July. The leaves are arrow-shaped, meaning that the blades are triangular and pointed. They can be from 2/3 to 1 2/3 of a foot long. The leaf blades are fuzzy, especially on the top side. Arrowleaf balsamroot also has a large, deep, and thick taproot, which completes the name. So it might have a diameter of the width of a hand and a branching root going some feet deep. The thicker portions of the root can also be covered with a bark, and the balsam portion of the name refers to the resin inside the root. So yeah, they're a pretty cool native plant to this area. Nearly all parts of this plant were historically used by various indigenous groups. The root can be baked or steamed and eaten, as well as young shoots. Immature flower stems could be peeled and eaten, and the flowers themselves are a good browse for wildlife. Balsam root seeds are nutritious as well, and oil rich, and another good source of food. The root can also be used as a coffee substitute and has been used medicinally. So lots of awesome things going on with balsam root there. And the main way to tell the difference is that the leaves are a bit smoother and that the balsam root leaves are hairier on top as well. Next, we have Oxeye daisy and Alpine aster. Sometimes these two can get confused since they're both daisy-like. Oxeye daisy, depending on your opinion, maybe you hate this plant, maybe you think it's very beautiful. Either way, at some point, I'm sure we've all picked it in our life. Maybe you've had a bouquet or made a flower crown out of it. It was first introduced to North America in seed mixes and is commonly sold in many store-bought wildflower mixes and remains popular among gardeners despite its negative impacts. It spreads super rapidly and is often found in pastures and grasslands. Definitely an issue around my management area over here by Kimberley, Tata Creek area. You do see a lot of fields of white nowadays. A single plant can produce up to 26,000 seeds and survive in the soil for up to 20 years. This plant's a big issue because of its size and its density rate. It can really reduce forage for livestock and wildlife, and especially ungulates, they don't want to eat this stuff. It is considered noxious in lots of parts of BC. It has this daisy-like appearance with a single white flowers at the end of a stem and contains 20 to 30 petals and a yellow center. It looks pretty similar also to the other invasive scentless chamomile. So we mentioned scentless chamomile a little earlier. They do have a more delicate fern-like leaf system, whereas the Oxeye daisy has this big, almost bulbous end on its leaves. On the right-hand side, we have Alpine aster. So this will bloom anywhere from late summer to late fall. So it'll be in bloom now or coming up soon. They range from about 1 to 5 centimeters wide and are 10 to 35 centimeters tall with long, thin petals. They can have purple, pink, or white flower heads as well, sometimes burgundy or yellow. So they do have lots of different colors, which is why they can get confused for the daisy as well. And they're also commonly seen in fields and on roadsides. So they like similar places too. As a food source, asters are invaluable to birds, mammals, and insects alike. Nectars and pollens from these plants are an important fall food for butterflies, moths, bees, and other beneficial insects. So one way you might be able to tell them apart is the bloom time. Asters kind of come out now till later in the fall, and Oxeye daisy stays in bloom quite often and starts many months earlier. An honorable mention here, a grass. I am not a grass expert. Our PD is, so if you have any grass questions, feel free to ask her. But it is cheatgrass versus Canada wild rye. Cheatgrass is a tufted, cool season annual bunch grass. At maturity, the foliage and seed heads often become purplish before drying out completely, before they become brown or tan. So you can kind of see in this photo those burgundy or almost reddish, purplish colored things on the grass. They characteristically reach a height of 4 to 36 inches, and the blades are flat and less than a 1/4 inch wide and up to 6 1/4 inches long. Both surfaces are softly hairy. It flowers in May to June and usually drooping to one side. It's cultivated and disturbed. It likes cultivated and disturbed or degraded sites in meadows, grasslands, woodlands, and riparian communities and roadsides with elevations generally below 8,500 feet. It reproduces by seed, and the density of cheatgrass plants can range between 1 and 1,400 plants per square foot. It does average about 600 plants per square foot. So if you want to go out with a little foot-long stick, you can be able to count how many are in there. It might take you a little while. They're native to Eurasia and Africa, and has compressed phenology and usually dries out and casts seeds by mid-June. I bring up cheatgrass because it's becoming more prolific in this area, and because they're so dry, they're a really good fuel for wildfire. If fires occur frequently, perennials will likely give way to a community dominated by cheatgrass and other annuals. So it not only can help start the wildfire, but it's really great at moving in and doing really well afterwards too. On the right-hand side, we have wild rye. Native to much of North America, it's most abundant in the Central Plains and Great Plains. It grows in a number of ecosystems, including woodlands, savannas, prairies, and sometimes areas that have been disturbed as well. It's a perennial bunch grass and reaches heights of 1 to 1.5 meters, so quite a bit bigger than the cheatgrass. It grows from a small rhizome and forms a shallow, fine root network. It has terminal spike-shaped like seed heads, kind of like oat seeds, with these long bristly awns that cause the stem to bend and droop. So sometimes they can get a little bit droopy, not quite like the cheatgrass, however, that has this whole deep bend happening. It does display a heavy, whiskery, nodding seed head in early fall as well, and it can be used for stabilizing eroded areas and for vegetating metal-rich soils in reclaimed mine sites. So if you're by a reclaimed mine site or are dealing with one that you have to mitigate, this might be a good option for you. And last but not least on our ID here is Himalayan blackberry versus thimbleberry. So Himalayan blackberry, absolutely delicious, but extremely invasive. They have small white flowers, which you can see in the bottom left-hand side there, that are 2.5 centimeters in diameter. They can be white to pinkish, stalked, 5 petals arranged in clusters of 5 to 20. The flower stalks are woolly and prickly, and the stems are robust, stiff that support large, flattened, and hooked or straight prickles. So definitely prickly, like lots of the other berries we have around here. Their canes can grow up to 3 meters in height and up to 12 meters in length, so they get pretty darn humongous. The first year only produces leaves and can root a little at the tips, producing daughter plants. So they grow really, really well in that way and can grow exponentially by creating these daughter plants and expanding quickly. They have evergreen leaves, which make them a little different from our thimbleberry. You can see in the background of the right side photo what the thimbleberry leaf looks like, so it's quite a bit different. They come in these sections of like 3 to 5 leaves on each side. It's a variable species, so it has several different cultivars, which can make identification a little bit difficult to find true Himalayan blackberry. But if you are unsure, you're always welcome to send us in a photo too. It can be found on disturbed sites and roadsides, right-of-ways. It definitely likes disturbed land, but it also does well in freshwater wetlands and riparian areas too. So even though it prefers rich, well-drained soils, it can definitely grow in a variety of barren and infertile soil types. And then on the right-hand side, we have our native thimbleberry. Definitely delicious, hopefully slightly more delicious than the Himalayan blackberry. It's easiest to ID when in flower or fruiting. The flowers are large and composed of 5 bright white petals in groups of 2 to 11 at the tops of stems. I'm sure you may have seen these along many of our wonderful hiking paths, especially if you're near an avalanche area or if it's a little bit more wet. They have red dome-shaped berries similar to raspberries, and these are generally soft when ripe. Their leaves kind of look like maple leaves, which is the best way to ID them as their giant broad leaf. All right, so in our last few minutes here, how can you prevent the spread? We've gone over quite a few invasives today, and how can you stop these all on your own? So our best method is prevention. Play Clean Go is one of our biggest campaigns, and on our own small scale, we can all do this. So maybe that's brushing your boots before and after heading out on the trails, carrying a little boot brush in your car. I am happy to get you one if you're close to me. I'll drive it right to your house. Wash your trucks regularly and your gear and your bikes, especially if you know it's an area that's prolific with invasives. Hose or brush down your tires too. Before moving on to your next adventure, and even the bottom of your cars, if you have the opportunity to do so. Make sure there's no seeds in the mud under there. Making sure to check your pets. I have a long-haired border collie. Holy moly, I gotta check her for burrs and remove them carefully, making sure that we're not spreading stuff around. Don't compost or burn invasives before checking whether or not they can reproduce that way. And report invasive plants when you see them so they can be written into mitigation plans. For all the gardeners out there, grow me instead, be plant-wise. Many of us enjoy growing wildflowers in our own gardens. You can ask for a seed analysis certification. Check the ingredients. I've been to a lot of different garden centers this year looking for my own garden, and almost every single one I saw had some kind of invasive in it. It's okay to ask garden centers and put some pressure on to make sure they're bringing in analyzed seed certified packets and making sure that it really is native seeds in those wildflower blends. And thinking long term, it's tempting to plant beautiful invasive plants, but what about the next owner or if it escapes your yard? I recently moved into a new house and I'm dealing with quite a few invasive plants that are very beautiful, but very tricky as things have gotten out of control. So just being mindful of that as well. What to do if you find an invasive plant? Report them. Use the Report Invasives app or remove them. We'll talk about the Report Invasives app in 2 slides. I just wanted to give a shout out quickly to iNaturalist as well, another amazing app to confirm or ID a plant and contribute to community or citizen science. Many people in our area do use this, so you can see what's nearby. And last but not least, quickly talking about the Report Invasive app. This is the provincial reporting system for the public. That's a part of a bigger program that us and other land managers use to document and manage invasive species infestations. It's a tool to identify as well. I do prefer iNaturalist to ID, but this can also be used in a pinch and offline. So yeah, it's a pretty simple invasives app to use. You can search by color as well. And there's also a unknown option at the very bottom. So if you can't find it on there, you can type in unknown. All your entries go to a lovely lady in Victoria named Judith, and she passes this on to us. So definitely use the app. I will note that we used to tout Report a Weed app a lot. That app's been being taken offline. So if you have that app already, make sure to switch it over to Report Invasives app. And I see we're at 2 o'clock. Thank you guys for bearing with me here. Definitely appreciate you all being here. Just a few other last ways to do this. If you do have an invasive species on private land, make sure to contact the RDEK directly. We do not do mitigation on private land, so definitely forward them to the contact below or by searching on their website. And thank you guys so much. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you'll be able to tell some invasive and native plants apart now. As always, you can always reach out to us by email or through our website and we can answer any more questions.